During early urban engagements in Western Europe, German tank crews began encountering a newly introduced Allied infantry-carried anti-armor weapon that appeared modest in size and unconventional in form compared to the large-caliber anti-tank guns they were accustomed to facing. And in those first sightings, it was not regarded as a serious threat to armored vehicles. Reports from field units described it as a short-range device carried by infantry rather than mounted artillery. Dome in its initial appearance suggested limited destructive capability against hardened tank plating. In several towns where German armor advanced through narrow streets, the weapon was observed in the hands of Allied infantry positioned behind rubble or within damaged buildings. Yet the crews operating the tanks often interpreted its deployment as a sign of Allied desperation rather than innovation. The tanks themselves had previously survived encounters with heavier guns positioned at range, and confidence in their armor protection led many crews to assume that a smaller infantry-held device would lack the penetration necessary to inflict meaningful damage. This perception was reinforced by early engagements in which the weapon was fired without immediately visible catastrophic effect, allowing tanks to continue operating after contact. Commanders noted that the absence of dramatic results aligned with their expectation that close-range infantry systems were unlikely to rival established anti-tank artillery in effectiveness. As a result, the presence of the weapon did not initially alter operational behavior, and armored units maintained standard movement through contested urban zones without significant adjustment. The belief that their tanks remained secure against this new threat became part of routine field assumptions, communicated informally among crews, and reinforced by the continued mobility of vehicles after early encounters. In operational briefings, the weapon was mentioned more as a curiosity than as a decisive factor, and its deployment was interpreted as an Allied attempt to compensate for limitations in heavier equipment during close fighting. Within this atmosphere of confidence, German armor continued advancing through dense environments where infantry-held weapons were expected, but not feared, and the new device remained categorized as a secondary concern rather than a primary danger to the survivability of their vehicles. The first sustained battlefield encounters with the new Allied infantry anti-armor weapon took place during close urban fighting, where German tank crews operated within narrow streets bordered by damaged buildings and improvised barricades, environments that limited the effectiveness of long-range anti-tank guns, but allowed infantry to approach armored vehicles from concealed positions. In these early clashes, the weapon was observed being deployed at relatively short distances, often from behind rubble piles or from within the shadowed interiors of partially collapsed structures. When the device was fired, it produced an impact against tank armor that was audible and forceful, yet did not immediately result in catastrophic destruction, allowing the vehicle to continue its advance in several recorded instances. Crews reported the sensation of a localized strike, accompanied by surface damage, but without full penetration during these initial engagements, though reinforcing their belief that the weapon lacked the power necessary to compromise the integrity of armored plating. This perception was further supported by the continued mobility of tanks following such encounters, as vehicles remained operational and capable of completing assigned movements despite sustaining superficial effects. Commanders reviewing after-action summaries noted that while the weapon represented a new infantry capability, its apparent limitations during these first uses aligned with expectations that small-scale devices could not rival the destructive capacity of established artillery systems. As a result, the encounters did not prompt immediate doctrinal changes, and armored units continued to advance through contested sectors, with standard spacing and formation discipline. Infantry accompanying the tanks maintained vigilance against potential ambush positions, yet the presence of the weapon did not significantly alter tactical confidence within the crews. Reports circulated informally among units that the new device produced noise and impact without decisive consequence, and this narrative contributed to a sense of familiarity rather than alarm. In subsequent engagements across similar environments, tanks that encountered the weapon again experienced comparable results, sustaining minor external damage while preserving operational function. The repetition of these outcomes solidified the impression that the device, though novel, was unlikely to pose a serious threat under most circumstances. Within this framework of experience, German armored forces continued to regard the weapon as an interesting but ultimately limited addition to Allied infantry arsenals, one that did not necessitate immediate adaptation in movement patterns or protective measures. Although early battlefield encounters appeared to confirm German assumptions about the limited effectiveness of the new Allied infantry-carried anti-armor weapon, Allied units continued to deploy it across multiple sectors, indicating that its persistence was based on more than symbolic value or desperation. The device's design emphasized portability and adaptability rather than raw destructive spectacle, allowing infantry to maneuver it through environments where traditional anti-tank guns could not be positioned effectively. Its relatively compact structure meant it could be carried into confined urban spaces, narrow alleys, and interior defensive points without requiring heavy transport or elaborate setup procedures. Allied training began incorporating the weapon into close-range engagement tactics that focused on exploiting terrain rather than overpowering armor through direct confrontation. Instead of relying on long-distance penetration, its effectiveness depended on positioning and timing, enabling infantry to operate in proximity to armored vehicles without exposing themselves to open-field counterfire. This operational philosophy contrasted with earlier anti-tank strategies that emphasized range and caliber, and it reflected an evolving understanding of how urban combat could alter the balance between armor and infantry. The German field observations initially interpreted the continued presence of the weapon as a matter of Allied necessity rather than tactical innovation, assuming that its widespread use stemmed from shortages of heavier systems. However, the repeated integration of the device into infantry formations suggested a deliberate role within broader battlefield planning. Reports from advancing units began to note that Allied infantry equipped with the weapon demonstrated increased willingness to engage in confined environments where tanks could not maneuver freely. These conditions reduced the advantage of armor thickness and created opportunities for localized pressure that traditional artillery might have struggled to deliver within such tight spaces. The weapon's deployment pattern revealed that its true potential lay not in isolated impacts, but in cumulative influence over how infantry approached armored threats during urban engagements. By embedding the device into regular infantry operations, Allied forces effectively expanded their anti-armor reach into spaces previously dominated by tanks. German crews, still confident in their vehicles' resilience, continued to view the weapon as secondary. Yet its sustained presence hinted at a deeper shift in how the battlefield itself was being contested, one in which mobility and proximity could challenge assumptions rooted in armor superiority. As urban fighting intensified across contested European towns, Allied infantry began adapting the new anti-armor weapon into structured close-quarters tactics that focused on positioning rather than direct confrontation, using damaged buildings, rubble corridors, and narrow street angles to bring the device within effective range without exposing themselves unnecessarily. Rather than treating it as a substitute for traditional artillery, they incorporated it into coordinated movement patterns that allowed infantry teams to operate in proximity to advancing armor, while remaining concealed until the moment of engagement. This tactical integration emphasized patience and timing, with soldiers positioning themselves at points where tanks were forced to slow or maneuver, such as intersections obstructed by debris or streets narrowed by collapsed structures. German armored crews, then accustomed to maintaining forward momentum through such environments, often prioritized movement over detection of close-range threats, and the weapon's deployment exploited this dynamic by appearing in positions where conventional anti-tank guns could not be installed. Reports from the field began to describe instances where infantry teams armed with the device engaged tanks from elevated positions within buildings or from behind structural cover that shielded them from immediate retaliation. While these engagements did not always produce catastrophic results, they introduced localized pressure that disrupted the rhythm of armored movement and required crews to reassess their surroundings more frequently. The weapon's presence in these confined spaces gradually expanded the range of infantry influence within urban engagements, transforming areas once considered secure for armored transit into zones requiring caution. My German units noted that tanks encountering resistance in such conditions were sometimes forced to alter routes or reduce speed, indirectly affecting operational tempo. The cumulative effect of these tactical applications began to shift the perception of the device from a mere curiosity to a situational factor capable of influencing movement patterns during close fighting. Although its individual impact remained less dramatic than that of heavier systems, its integration into coordinated infantry actions revealed a new dimension of anti-armor capability that operated within the constraints of urban terrain. By leveraging the environment to compensate for limited size and range, Allied forces expanded their options for engaging armored threats in spaces where traditional methods were impractical, and the weapon's role evolved from incidental to deliberate within the broader framework of urban combat operations. The first confirmed successes involving the new Allied infantry anti-armor weapon emerged not from open battlefields, but from confined urban sectors where tanks were forced to navigate tight intersections and debris-lined corridors. And in these environments, the device began demonstrating results that differed from earlier encounters. Reports from advancing German units described vehicles that, after entering narrow streets bordered by damaged buildings, encountered localized engagements that resulted in mechanical disruption or loss of mobility rather than immediate destruction. In several documented instances, tanks operating within these constrained spaces experienced sudden immobilization following close-range contact, forcing crews to halt and reassess their position while infantry advanced cautiously around the disabled vehicles. The absence of traditional artillery signatures initially led some commanders to attribute these incidents to structural obstacles or pre-existing mechanical strain. Yet further observation revealed consistent patterns linked to infantry activity in proximity to the affected vehicles. Allied teams, positioned behind rubble or within partially collapsed structures, that had begun deploying the weapon in ways that targeted points of vulnerability created by the urban environment, rather than relying solely on brute penetration. These engagements demonstrated that even without catastrophic results, the ability to halt a tank's movement could alter the dynamics of an advance, as immobilized vehicles became obstacles for those following behind. German field summaries noted that in streets where such incidents occurred, that convoy momentum was disrupted, and infantry support had to be redirected to secure the immediate area. Although individual events remained limited in scale, their cumulative effect introduced a new operational concern: the possibility that close-range infantry systems could influence armored mobility in environments previously considered manageable. As similar reports accumulated across different sectors, commanders began to recognize that the weapon's impact extended beyond its apparent physical size or range, contributing instead to a broader pattern of localized interference that could shape the flow of urban engagements. The realization that a compact device could produce such outcomes prompted closer examination of infantry movements within contested streets, even as armored units continued to rely on their established confidence in protection. These early successes did not immediately overturn prevailing assumptions, but they marked the first indication that the weapon's role might be more consequential than initially believed, particularly in situations where terrain constrained both maneuver and visibility. As engagements continued across multiple urban sectors, the influence of the Allied infantry anti-armor weapon expanded beyond isolated incidents into a recurring element of close-quarters combat, with its presence increasingly shaping how infantry approached armored threats in environments defined by limited maneuverability and obstructed lines of sight. The field reports from German units began to document a growing number of encounters, in which tanks experienced disruptions to their movement, following contact in confined spaces. These incidents often occurred in districts where rubble and structural damage forced vehicles to reduce speed, creating conditions that allowed infantry teams equipped with the weapon to operate within effective proximity. The repetition of such outcomes across different towns and operational zones suggested that its integration into infantry tactics was neither accidental nor limited to a single formation. Allied forces appeared to be standardizing its use within urban operations, positioning teams in locations where tanks were most likely to encounter difficulty navigating terrain. German commanders reviewing after-action summaries noted that even when vehicles remained operational, the requirement to pause or alter course in response to these engagements affected the tempo of movement and required additional coordination between armor and infantry support. This emerging pattern prompted adjustments in situational awareness among crews, who began to monitor building interiors and rubble lines more carefully than before. The weapon's spread within Allied formations also introduced variability in engagement outcomes, making it more challenging for armored units to anticipate the level of threat present in any given street or intersection. While the device itself remained relatively small and portable, its cumulative effect lay in its consistent deployment across environments where traditional anti-tank systems could not easily function. The gradual increase in reported incidents reflected a shift in operational reality, as the weapon became a common feature of infantry actions in urban settings, rather than an occasional anomaly. German units, while maintaining overall confidence in their armor, began to incorporate this factor into planning considerations, recognizing that the evolving battlefield required attention to close-range dynamics as well as long-range threats. The spread of the weapon's impact did not produce immediate doctrinal change, but it signaled that urban engagements were becoming arenas in which infantry-held systems could exert meaningful influence on armored movement over time. As reports accumulated from multiple sectors describing tanks that had been slowed, redirected, or temporarily disabled following close-range engagements in urban terrain, German armored units began reassessing their earlier assumptions regarding the Allied infantry anti-armor weapon. What had initially been regarded as a minor curiosity now appeared in after-action summaries with increasing frequency, prompting commanders to examine whether these incidents reflected coincidence or an emerging tactical pattern. Crews who had previously advanced through narrow streets with confidence now found themselves instructed to exercise greater caution when approaching intersections bordered by damaged buildings or debris-lined corridors where infantry could conceal movement. Field communications emphasized the need for enhanced coordination with accompanying infantry support, particularly in areas where visibility was reduced by structural damage or smoke. Although the weapon did not consistently produce catastrophic destruction, its demonstrated ability to disrupt movement introduced an operational variable that could not be ignored. Tanks immobilized within tight urban passages created obstacles not only for themselves, but also for following vehicles, complicating convoy progression and requiring additional effort to secure surrounding areas. Commanders reviewing engagement logs observed that the cumulative effect of such disruptions could influence the timing and cohesion of advances, especially in districts where terrain already constrained maneuverability. As a result, crews were advised to adjust their approach when entering contested streets, maintaining vigilance for potential close-range threats, in addition to the long-range artillery they had traditionally prioritized. The growing awareness of this factor led to subtle shifts in movement discipline, with greater emphasis placed on reconnaissance of building interiors and rubble clusters that might conceal infantry teams. While confidence in armor protection remained largely intact, the acknowledgement that a portable device could influence operational tempo marked a departure from earlier perceptions. The reaction did not constitute a full doctrinal overhaul, but reflected a pragmatic adaptation to evolving battlefield conditions in which infantry-held systems played a more active role than previously anticipated. The presence of the weapon, once dismissed as incidental, now contributed to planning considerations during urban engagements, signaling that the balance between armor and infantry was becoming increasingly shaped by terrain and proximity, rather than solely by firepower. By the later stages of urban engagements, the cumulative influence of the Allied infantry anti-armor weapon had produced a measurable shift in how armored units operated within confined environments, not by replacing established threats, but by adding a persistent close-range factor that required consideration alongside traditional artillery. Tanks entering dense districts no longer advanced with the same unqualified confidence that had characterized earlier encounters. As the possibility of localized disruption became part of operational awareness. Movement through narrow streets increasingly involved coordinated reconnaissance and closer infantry support to identify positions from which infantry teams might engage at short distance. The weapon's role in shaping this adaptation lay not in singular dramatic events, but in the steady pattern of incidents that demonstrated its capacity to influence mobility under specific conditions. Commanders reviewing operational data observed that urban terrain now demanded a more cautious approach, with attention directed toward intersections, building interiors, and debris corridors, where proximity could negate some advantages of armor thickness. This adjustment reflected a broader understanding that battlefield effectiveness depended not only on the strength of equipment, but also on how terrain and tactics interacted. The presence of a compact infantry system, capable of contributing to localized outcomes, encouraged a more integrated approach between armor and accompanying forces, emphasizing coordination over assumption. As a result, the balance of movement within contested towns evolved, with armored units adapting their entry and progression strategies to account for the additional variable introduced by close-range infantry capabilities. The shift did not eliminate the dominance of armor in open terrain, but within urban settings, it introduced a layer of complexity that reshaped engagement patterns. By influencing how tanks approached confined spaces, the weapon contributed to a gradual recalibration of expectations, replacing earlier dismissal with measured respect for the interplay between infantry initiative and environmental constraints. In this way, what had once been regarded as an incidental device became a factor in operational planning, illustrating how adaptation on one side could prompt reconsideration on the other. The battlefield did not transform overnight, yet through repeated encounters, the integration of this weapon into urban tactics subtly altered the dynamics of armored movement, marking a transition from confidence, rooted solely in protection, to awareness shaped by experience.